In the first weeks of April 1964, the Beatles held the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously. This had never happened before in the history of the chart, which had been tracking American popular music since 1958. The top position, the second position, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, all 5 occupied by the same 4 young men from Liverpool who had arrived in America in February to an airport reception that the press had been writing about with the vocabulary reserved for events that required a new category. The chart, and what it represented about what Americans were listening to in that particular season of their cultural life, was a document of a shift that the music industry had been absorbing for months. Something had changed. Something specific and large had changed about the relationship between popular music and its audience. And the change had a name and 4 faces, and a sound that was simultaneously familiar and unlike anything the American radio landscape had contained before. The Beatles had arrived, and the charts were the clearest possible record of what that arrival had meant. Louis Armstrong was 62 years old in April of 1964. He had been a professional musician since the early 1920s, which meant that his career predated the chart by more than 30 years, predated the concept of a pop chart by more than a decade, predated most of the musical categories that the chart tracked by an era. He had been a significant figure in American popular music since before most of the people currently occupying the Billboard Hot 100 had been born. The music industry of 1964 did not know what to do with this fact. Armstrong's commercial relevance, in the calculations of the record labels and the radio programmers and the chart analysts who made up the machinery of the popular music business in 1964, was something that required careful framing. He was respected. He was legendary. He was, in the specific vocabulary of the industry, an artist of historical importance. What he was not, by the standards of what the chart was tracking in the season of Beatlemania, was someone who could be expected to produce a record that the American public would rush to purchase in the quantities that the chart required. He had been signed to Cap Records, a smaller label that had made the decision to record Armstrong performing material from a Broadway musical that had opened in January of 1964 and had been immediately successful. The musical was Hello, Dolly, a show set in the 1890s starring Carol Channing, featuring a title song with a particular quality of warmth and exuberance that was, in its way, exactly the kind of material that Armstrong's voice and trumpet had been built for. The recording was not a strategic calculation. It was a match between a song that needed a certain kind of voice and a voice that had been that kind for 50 years. The recording was made. The single was released. And what happened next was not something that anyone in the music industry's analytical apparatus had prepared for. The response to the chart position was of the kind that arrives when something happens that everyone agrees is remarkable, but that the available vocabulary is slightly inadequate to describe. The press covered it. The industry acknowledged it. The fact of a 62-year-old jazz musician from New Orleans knocking the Beatles off the #1 position in the middle of Beatlemania was the kind of story that wrote itself. Surprising, warm, carrying the particular quality of improbability that makes a news item feel like more than a news item. The Beatles themselves were asked about it. What they said was gracious and genuine, in the way that the public statements of young musicians about their predecessors are sometimes genuinely gracious, and sometimes gracious as a matter of professional obligation. In this case, those who knew them understood it to be the former. The Beatles knew who Louis Armstrong was. They had grown up in a musical environment in which American jazz and American popular music of the pre-rock era were not historical relics, but living parts of the landscape. The specific quality of their graciousness about Armstrong's chart position had in it the ring of something they actually meant. Armstrong's response to the chart position was characteristically compressed. He was not a man who celebrated his own commercial achievements in the expansive way that some performers celebrate these things. He was pleased. He expressed his pleasure in the terms he used for things that had gone well, warmly, briefly, without the particular kind of fanfare that the moment might have seemed to invite. The record was at number 1. The song was a good song. He had enjoyed recording it. What he did not do was frame the chart position as a vindication, as a rebuttal to anyone who had suggested that his commercial moment had passed, as a demonstration that legacy and relevance were not mutually exclusive, as a proof of anything that required proof. He understood what the chart position was, and he understood what it wasn't. And he was enough of a musician and enough of a professional to know the difference between a good record and a career verdict. The industry's response was more complex. The chart position created a particular kind of problem for the commercial logic that had placed Armstrong in the legacy category. If he was no longer commercially relevant, the chart said otherwise. If his audience was limited to people who appreciated the history of jazz, the chart said those people included enough of the American public to produce a #1 record in the middle of the most commercially powerful chart run in the history of the Hot 100. The resolution the industry arrived at was characteristic. It acknowledged the chart position as exceptional, as an anomaly, a lovely surprise, a testament to the enduring quality of Armstrong's artistry, without substantially revising the commercial calculations that had placed him in the legacy category in the first place. He was still legacy. He was now legacy that had, improbably and wonderfully, produced a #1 record. This was the frame. It was a frame that allowed the industry to honor what had happened without having to change what it thought it knew about how the commercial landscape worked. The song itself continued to perform. It remained on the chart for weeks after its peak. The musical Hello, Dolly benefited from the exposure in ways that its producers noted with the specific gratitude of theatrical people whose work has received an unexpected piece of commercial grace. Armstrong performed the song in subsequent concerts, adding it to the repertoire with the ease of someone incorporating material that has always suited them. The position that Louis Armstrong occupied in the American music industry of 1964 was a position that the industry had a clear and consistent name for: legacy. He was a legacy artist, which meant that his importance was historical rather than commercial, that his value was in what he had done rather than what he was doing, that the correct context for encountering his work was not the radio and not the chart, but the record collection of someone who appreciated the history of the music rather than its present. This was not, by the standards of the industry, an insult. It was a category, one that came with its own kind of respect, its own kind of institutional acknowledgement, its own particular way of being honored while being simultaneously set aside from the commercial conversation. Legacy was how the industry managed the transition from relevance to history while maintaining the dignity of the artist in question. Armstrong was legacy. He was also, by the spring of 1964, 62 years old, and in the third decade of a career that had already produced more than most careers produce in their entirety. What the industry's category failed to account for was the specific quality of what Armstrong brought to whatever material he performed. This was not a new failure. The industry had consistently underestimated this quality throughout Armstrong's career, had consistently placed him in categories that his actual performances then exceeded. He was categorized as an entertainer when he was one of the most technically significant musicians of the 20th century. He was categorized as old-fashioned when what he was doing was simply operating at a level that the fashion of the moment hadn't caught up to and would eventually circle back to. The Hello, Dolly recording was, in retrospect, a perfect example of what happened when Armstrong performed material that suited his voice. The song was not complicated. It was warm. It was exuberant. It had a particular quality of invitation, of a person genuinely glad to see the people they were addressing, that was, in Armstrong's hands, not performed, but simply expressed. The voice that had been roughened and made more honest by 50 years of singing and playing, that had traded the cleanness of its early range for the richness of something more weathered, that contained in its texture the audible evidence of a life fully lived. That voice wrapped around the song and made it something that was simultaneously the song and his relationship to it. The single entered the chart. It climbed. The chart was dominated by the Beatles and by the other records that Beatlemania had elevated through association, and by the general commercial energy of a moment in American popular music that felt like a definitive break with what had come before. And Louis Armstrong's record climbed through all of it. In the week of May 9th, 1964, the Billboard Hot 100 listed Louis Armstrong's Hello, Dolly at number 1. The Beatles had held that position. They no longer held it. The man who had been recording music since before Billboard's chart existed, who was older than most of the people who worked in the industry that the chart tracked, who had been categorized as legacy and historical and not commercially relevant, that man's record was at the top of the American chart. He was 62 years old. He was the oldest artist in the history of the Hot 100 to reach the number 1 position. He would remain the oldest for decades. What the chart position of May 1964 reveals about Louis Armstrong, and about the nature of what he was doing in the later years of his career, is something that those who study his work return to when they want to understand the relationship between commercial success and artistic integrity in the arc of a very long musical life. Armstrong had been in the music industry long enough to understand that the chart and the music were related, but not identical. That a record could be at the top of the chart for reasons that had very little to do with its musical quality, and could be ignored by the chart for reasons that had very little to do with its musical quality. He had seen enough cycles of the commercial landscape, had watched enough things that were fashionable become unfashionable, and then, years later, essential, that the specific verdict of the chart in any given week was not something he allowed to become the primary measure of his own sense of what he was doing. Hello, Dolly was at number 1 because it was a good song, performed by someone whose voice was completely suited to it. In a recording that captured, with the efficiency that the best recordings capture, something that was genuinely present in the room when it was made. This was what Armstrong had always done. What the chart of May 1964 said was that it had not stopped working, that the connection between what he offered and what a large portion of the American public wanted to receive had not been severed by the arrival of a new musical moment. It had simply been waiting for the right material. The specific irony of the situation, that the record which most clearly demonstrated Armstrong's continued commercial vitality, was a song from a musical set in the 1890s, recorded by a 62-year-old musician whose career had begun in the 1920s, which reached number 1 in the middle of the most aggressively modern chart run in the history of the Hot 100, was not lost on those who found it meaningful. Armstrong, for his part, did not spend much time on the irony. He performed Hello, Dolly. He recorded more. He continued touring. He continued doing what he had always done, showing up night after night in whatever room the schedule placed him in, and giving whatever the room required. The chart had said something. He had noted it, and then he had continued. The Beatles were asked years later about the period of 1964, the chart dominance, the extraordinary commercial moment, the particular quality of what it felt like to be inside that. They spoke about it with the perspective that time provides, warmly, with a clear sense of what it had been and also what it had not been. They spoke about Armstrong in those later conversations with a directness that went beyond the gracious acknowledgement of the moment. They knew what Hello Dolly reaching #1 had meant. They understood the quality of what they had been, briefly and improbably, displaced by. In May of 1964, the most dominant chart run in the history of American popular music was interrupted by a 62-year-old jazz musician from New Orleans who had been making records since the 1920s. The interruption lasted 1 week on the chart. The recording that caused it has never stopped being played, which is not what the chart tracks, which is the thing that outlasts what the chart tracks, which is, as it turned out, what Louis Armstrong had always been producing, whether or not anyone was counting.